So, thank you very much. I know this is the last presentation of the day. I know a lot of people were expecting this presentation. I get everybody telling me, we're expecting for that reconciliation. It's the real problem. My name is Roque Gagliano. I'm a software solution architect at NSO. And the title of this presentation is Reconcile Your Service. I didn't choose the title, by the way. And from POC to operation reality. So I run POCs, and Mikael, who's here, runs operation reality. So I'm going to be talking about the POC piece and leave all the difficult things for Mike to deal with. So, a couple of years ago, I did a Scrum Master certification class. And one of the things I didn't like a lot about that training was that every time you ask a question, the answer was always, depends. And unfortunately, this is a topic now maybe I will be forced to answer many times, so it depends. Because when we talk about operation reality, it really means that, these sort of things are very dependent on what is your operation reality. And that's unfortunately very different from each one of you. So there is, when you talk about complexity, when you try to find definition of complexity, they talk about complexity as the hidden things, the things which are not obvious, correct? And when you try to do reconciliation, you start seeing things that are very hidden. It's not, here's my variable, here's my output. It's really things that are not there, supposedly are not there, but are there, correct? And sometimes we call this exercise actually service discovery, reconciliation, or we use a word like, service archaeology. Because that's what you're doing, like going back to the history of, whoever first configured a VPN service in your network, and the service is still there, it's up and running, and you need to reconcile and understand how is it done. So let's start this trip. So we're going to do some archaeology, and hopefully you get some tips on how things could be done. But I know a lot of people in the audience have a lot of experience and a lot of pain and a lot of scars. So I'm really looking forward to make this interaction. For me, it's more about facilitating let's say, the horizontal communication where we share, what has been done and maybe what can be done in the platform to facilitate you. We have an experience like a year and a half ago. We met with Doug and in the Stockholm office, and he was not aware that our reconciliation guidance in the development guide was just not working, correct? And in a matter of 2 weeks, we got a new code, we got new tools, and we got it running much better. So really, please send your feedback, come back to us, and let's make this very interactive. This is a very complex subject, okay? So with that said, so it's not working. So the agenda, I'm going to be doing a little introduction. I'm going to be talking a little bit about device reconciliation. We need to start somewhere. Actually, whoever was in Johan meeting yesterday, it's going to be like a little bit of refresh on what he already talked about, but I know some people were in the other room, so we're going to be doing that too. And then we're going to talk about different techniques to do reconciliation. Do we do top-down? Do we do bottom-up? How we do that. And I will do a simple demo. So I do simple things, and then Michael is going to come with a more complex demo. Okay? So my first advice, the best reconciliation strategy is no reconciliation. Like, in terms of, the best thing is, of course, we are always reconciled. We don't need to do any reconciliation because, you're either a greenfield scenario or, your service are already all defined in NSO. But we know the reality is a little bit different, correct? And actually, many people, when we go and do a POC for the first time in NSO, they come back and say, okay, this works in greenfield. And 99.9% of our customers are brownfields, correct? So actually, this is just impossible, correct? So in all our cases, we need to do certain reconciliation. And immediately when we start talking about, okay, let's do this reconciliation, let's discover the services that are in the network, the first thing that people come out and says, why you guys don't do it automatically in NSO? Why can't, I create my service code, I got my packages, I got my templates, just do request NSO service reconciliation. Okay, so I'm going to go and ask Sebastian, do it, program that in the network. But the reality is that we got a mathematical problem, correct? So we got FastMap, which is our mapping algorithm, correct? And we go from service instance, instance data and we map into configurations. But of course, that function in itself, it's not generically invertible, correct? There's not a mathematical way to say for any case, for any sort of use cases, from one set of config, I know exactly what's going to be the service definition, okay? So, we all know that we have a VRF, but maybe that VRF is part of a L3 VPN, or maybe it's part of some new routing technology for some new sort of services. So that generic, for every single case, it's not really possible. Of course, doesn't mean that we cannot do things to facilitate the way we do that discovery. And actually, there's a lot of people trying to do that. And of course, there's some maybe more simple cases. When you have, let's say, if most of your services are just direct mapping, then from the young model, you go straight to the configuration, and that mapping is, one-to-one, you can think on building something for you which is pretty much generic, correct, for your use cases. But that's not the reality for all our customers. And of course, you got even services that require resources, services that require talking to other tools, and all of that complexity needs to be, of course, embedded into the reconciliation logic. So I guess that's always the question, correct? When are you guys going to do automatic reconciliation in the next version of NSO, correct? And then definitely there's we got people, even Cisco Advanced Services and some of us has built some best practices and some framework and say, okay, these are the steps that you need to do. These are, maybe for those three, maybe for some of the steps we can have, generic ways to do it. But of course, it's not going to be a one simple, just like you do get modifications to do service reconciliation. And one of the reasons why this is so hard is because it's not just technology. So it's not just code that you need. Because, there's a lot of decision that needs to be taken when you find things which are not exactly looking like what you expect from a service. So we all know that sometimes, the people are supposed to, the description is supposed to have spaces and slash, but it doesn't have that. And you wonder, should I rewrite with a new way to write description? Should I leave it as it is? Should I change the service to include this new variant of the service? Correct? And all of that are in certain way related with a process that you have that you need to build. And it's also related on how you manage changes in your network. Okay? So there is a connection, of course, between the technology piece that we are building in NSO. So we're going to give you basically a lot of features that are going to allow you to do this reconciliation the simplest possible. But of course, that's going to be connected to, your operational processes and how you think reconciliation should be run. Should be run daily? Should be running just at the beginning? Correct? Should we allow or not, for example, should we allow or not changes directly in the devices? Is that something we want to modify or not? Etc. And when we think about those two, you also want to have a way to control that. So what we've seen also is that, in a way, you need to have this, even those manual processes, those verifications, those manual interventions, you want to have the way to somehow control that. So that's where mob automation comes in. So at the end of the day, when you try to do an automation, you have NSO and its primitive and its logic. you have your process and you may do daily, you schedule daily, and of course you have some sort of mob that says, when there is an exception, give it to an operator, they do the changes, they get a form, move it, move on, and be able to continue, okay? So my main point is that it's not just gonna be about, yes, I have in NSO all the possible toolings, it's really about also how I'm operating my network, and I'm making it this possible, correct? And one of the problems we see many times, and actually I think the example Michael is going to show is, in your network there is a lot of operational practices, and we saw in the KDDI example, which sometimes are very into the culture, correct? But not all those Asian practices are good for where we want to go, correct? So we may take those practices, and people are very hardcore in, hey, I want to be able to modify the devices and modify the services in the devices, and NSO has to discover whatever modification I've done every day, correct? Or I'm going to go and be able to create services, and you need to auto-discover them. So a lot of those sort of practices, it doesn't mean that, this could be an opportunity to change that behavior. And that sometimes we feel like it, particularly when it is the first NSO project, now we are in a little bit of a difficult situation, correct? Because you want your first project to go in. You want to have the buy-in from the people who operate, who do those things. But at the same time, you want to change some behaviors. So you cannot do everything at the same time, correct? It's kind of like hard to change behavior, and at the same time, get the buy-in because you want the tool to be used. So in that sense, I think it was very interesting what the KDDI people presented, because this semi-automation way is exactly what we're talking about. You have NSO and all the capability to do reconciliation. You have this operational practice, and maybe some sort of mob automation can help you to go into this semi-automation world where you can try to, get the buy-in, get NSO working, get their understanding that, yes, you can do reconciliation, but maybe it's not needed in the future. And then you go back to the best reconciliation is not reconciliation. Now, at the end of the day, I always pitch this that, think about this as a nuclear plant, correct? So in a way, you want to move operations to that sort of, you got your patch panel, and there's certain things you can do. So everything behaves a little bit under control. Of course, when you're in a nuclear plant or in an electrical power plant, every single PLC has a firmware and has actually a console cable, so has an RS-232. But, operators don't go with a laptop and go and program every single firmware, correct? And that's what we've been used for a very long time. Everybody enabled password of the firmware of every single device in the network. So in a way, the behavior changes for them is a little bit of, okay, I'm going to go give you the tooling, which is going to transform you in a little bit closer to, how a power plant looks like. Okay? So when we go into a project and we talk about reconciliation with our customers, typically there's two different areas, or there's two different, let's say, moments that we think about that. One is, of course, we go with install NSO the first time. We develop the NSO services, and NSO is up and running, and maybe you will use it for all the new services, correct? But the immediate question comes in, okay, what do I do with my old services? Because I may have a lot of L3 VPNs that are already there, and I want to manage just the same way I manage the new ones. And getting all these services into NSO, it's pretty important, because it also helps to the viability of the project, correct? So if NSO doesn't have, because the services which are already configured, maybe, it's going to be the large majority, and if NSO doesn't have the visibility of those services and kind of manage those services, the return on the investment that you're doing is very, very low. So we see that need to bring more and more knowledge into this NSO service layer to be able to do more with NSO and to show all the value of NSO. So it's always very important to try to get those services into NSO as soon as possible, okay? But, typically this is a job that, that's when we typically do all of the, what we call this archaeology, because that's when you start realizing many times that actually your service design didn't consider some corner cases because nobody had documented. So actually the initial reconciliation phase is also a phase that you may have to introduce some, for example, you may decide to do service changes to basically get that corner case into your service, correct? So there may be some, variants of the service that you discover during this reconciliation exercise. And, typically also it could be an opportunity to actually do some cleanup in the network. So, do you want to take that opportunity, or you want to do it or not? That's, again, that really depends on the customer. That's a little bit of risk, correct? Changing configs of services that have been running for years. So not everybody has the same risk profile, correct? Somebody's like, no, let's not touch it. And fortunately or unfortunately, it's much simpler sometimes to change an NSO service and to add a special case than just to change the config. When we do that initial reconciliation, there's different strategies. So some people say, and depends here of the service, is it just a VLAN in a device? So you can just reconciliate per device, or if it's a L3 VPN, which is something more big that includes many, many devices, CPE, PEs, etc. So think about, you can do like bulk, that, okay, today I'm migrating Milano, tomorrow I'm migrating Torino. Like you may select area, you may select PEs, and you do many of them one night or one afternoon. You can do on change, so every time a service change, I just migrate that, correct? So if I get a request from a service chain, and over time you think that's going to be, progressively increasing the number of services that will be reconciliated. The nice thing about on change is that the customer is expecting some downtime or something. So there is a communication with the customer going on. But of course, the problem is we go back is that it may be very slow to be able to basically get you into a critical mass on getting all the service into NSO. And of course, on demand, just on demand of the customer. But the majority, I think, I don't know your experience, you guys can share, but I think most of the people really try to go to the bulk to try to say, okay, I got an NSO running for the new services, it is what the as is, I'm working with it, let's start migrating service into NSO, okay? And of course, when we say bulk, it doesn't mean that you do all the network, so you always start with a specific area, like a test, many times in a maintenance windows, correct? And many times, it's something that even we try to train the customer to do because that's very specific to their operations, correct? Now, even if you finish, let's say that you were able to migrate 100% of your services into NSO, correct? Let's say you know that you migrated that. That means that you can count the number of services you have, which is already something interesting. So the question is, what happened over time? People, are you allowing people to enter the devices? And maybe somebody needed to change bandwidth, and something happened, and somebody did it. The equipment was disconnected, and somebody did it in the equipment because of some emergency. So what about the ongoing reconciliation that may happen over time? So, of course, all the preparation of the coding that you did for the first reconciliation, you can use then to do some ongoing checks, correct? So when we think about that, actually, we need to think of that also as an opportunity. And that ongoing checks that everything is in sync is basically also an opportunity to detect, which are the operational circumstances that created that difference, and trying to remediate that. Because something is out of the ordinary. Right? What happened, and that guy needed to go to the device and change it, correct? So it's really about I think reconciliation at the end, it's more about a pattern analysis exercise. It's really about describing patterns, yes, in the config, yes, technical, but also in the behavior of the people. So, with NSO, you can do a check sync and know who changed what that night. And you can go back to him and say, you did this change. Can you just explain me? That's okay. I'm not going to reprimand you. I want to understand why you decided to go there. Maybe he has a very valid reason. Maybe your GUI, well, of course the GUI would be the number one reason, but maybe your own GUI has some issues, and you didn't know about it. So a lot of time what we ended up doing when we do reconciliation is really detecting these faults, reporting back, and trying to capture exceptions. And one of the important things when you are in regular reconciliation is that when you do initial reconciliation, you just typically do creation of new services, correct? You just onboarding service in NSO. But when you go regularly and you want to do like a check every week to see somebody modify something and NSO is not in sync with the network configs, maybe people modify a service. Or maybe people deleted a service. So there's a little bit more things that you need to do there, correct? And of course, when we have, thanks to NSO and his check sync capabilities, we can do a lot of that out of the shelf, correct? Any questions? Any comment? Does it resonate with the things? Yeah, you are embattled? Okay. Now, I'm talking in this introduction a little bit on, what can we do, correct? How can I go and take this problem? So let's talk about two different strategies. So we can have a strategy that we call top-down, or we can have a strategy which is bottom-up. So top-down is a little bit idealistic because it's very nice. The idea is I have my services, and those services, actually, all the data of that service, all those instances of services, all the different parameters of those instances are stored in my OSS. So my OSS service catalog has all that information, and I trust it. I repeat, I trust my OSS data. So if I trust my OSS data, it's really about just committing those changes into NSO. NSO is already in sync with the network, so basically you just apply FastMap. So there you go, automatic reconciliation. Okay? Okay, there's just some stuff that we need to do in the database, but that's very nice, correct? Because I can reuse the data that is already available. That's because if you want the entropy of that information is very high, because I have exactly the parameters that I need. Okay? Now, the reality is, how many of you would like to go to a top-down strategy? Believe in it? Okay. We have one friend who has good OSS data. But typically what we've seen is that people told us, the network is king. Now, of course, the network is king, and then the next question is for how long? Do we want to keep that for how long? And we know the network is too diverse, too complicated to be king for a long time. So, these are, when I talk about operational process mentality, maybe that's something we need to start saying, okay, no, that's okay. Yeah, the network is keen to get the packet moving around, but when we talk about understanding which of the services there, we need maybe NSO to be queen or somebody else. But the idea is that NSO can quickly get all the information from the devices. We all know how to do sync from. But the question is, of course, how do I move from device config to service instances? And that's the function that I said, and that's typically custom code. Correct? That's typically scripts that we need to build. Now, we may be able to create, in some cases, generic ways to do it. But in some other cases, it could be like a very, casuistic-based scripting. Now, once we have that service information in NSO, the next question is, well, we say the network is king. We don't trust the OSS, so what do we do about the OSS? Because now we have the service data in NSO, Are we going to also push that to reconciliate and help the OSS to be actually now at least better, improve the entropy of the data that is there, okay? That's not very common, I would say. It could be that people have like a batch process. And again, you can use that basically, for example, to improve your service inventory. Maybe you convince the IT people or IT goes and have a batch process, do some comparison, and they introduce some changes and manual processes, okay? But you rarely see NSO pushing data to external systems on that, okay? Now some of the main points, and we do this and then we go for a break. One is, of course, you need your service package. Okay, so you are reconciliate a service, so we are going to make the assumption that that service exists. So you still need to create your services, your young models, and your FastMap, correct? And as I said, as you reconciliate, you may be finding things which are a little bit like corner cases that you want to create in those corner cases, like modifications to that package, all right? So that's one of the things. Now, we're always going to start with reconciliate with the device, because we're going to make sure we're in sync with the devices before we try to discover services. It doesn't make a lot of sense to discover services when we are not in sync with the devices, okay? But one of the main points that's very interesting about this and what NSO gives you is that in most of the cases, let's say you don't want to do cleanups, okay? The whole reconciliation strategy is supposed to be internal to NSO. So these are basically changes in the database, correct? So you are creating new trees, new leaves, correct? You are changing some internal parameter, ref count, etc. But that's internal to the database, so you shouldn't be touching the configs into the devices. And that's something very simple to detect, because you have dry runs. So you can quickly detect, am I changing the devices? So if I'm changing the devices, it may be that your data, the quality of your data, or something in your logic of reconciliation is not working correctly. So that's very simple to detect with NSO when something is fishy. And you, of course, need to remove that, basically alarm somebody and tell, well, I tried to reconciliate. This is the parameters I found. These are the dry run changes. Can you verify that you want to do this? Okay? So that's very common. So in our reconciliation logic, we're going to do a couple of dry runs to make sure that we are not changing the network. And that's a little bit of what I mentioned about pattern recognition, correct? So you're doing that. You're taking information and then you are validating that pattern actually validates with what you would expect from the service you are creating. Okay? Now, the last point that I would say is that there are some specific points that could be net specific, correct? Like particularly for when we go into device reconciliations, and some of the stuff is interesting that there are features in the net that can help us to get that done better. And as I mentioned at the end, this is an opportunity to do cleanups. Do you want to take it or not, or do you want to move it to another time, correct? And it could be a very challenging endeavor, but because most of the customers come back and tells you, we're too special. Every project is special. Every service is special. Every service instance is special. So we will never be able to reconciliate. But the reality is that the 80-20 rules apply. So you can basically apply some automation tooling to do 80% of the reconciliation, and maybe for 20%, yes, there's a lot of manual work. There is some sort of analysis to understand why is this not normal? Can I move it to a more standard configuration or not? So let's not lose the hope. Let's always focus on that 80% and trying to get as much as we can into the system to basically enable that to be managed by NSO. So with that, it's my introduction. And then I'm going to be basically moving into the top-down and the bottom-up strategies and doing some example and sharing some code with you. Okay? Is that okay? Any questions? Yes, Ian. I can rephrase your question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you're saying reconciliation should never be trying to not put it as a barrier for a project.
Right. So what you want to do is, if you can get NSO up and running so that you can be using NSO to create new services early in the process, then reconciliation can take time afterwards, but at least you've got NSO in. If you say, I have a 6-month project to reconcile all my services before I can use NSO at all, that's what you want to avoid. So I was wondering if you were going to make the point. For me, there are two distinct things. There's service discovery, so that service is in the CDB. So later, that service can now be modified, deleted using NSO. That's one thing. But the other thing is resource reconciliation, so that you know what resources are in use, so you can then avoid those resources when NSO creates another service. For example, you want to create a brand new service. It doesn't care the service. You don't care there are services already in the network. You want to create a new one. You have to assign a VLAN ID. You've got to know which VLAN IDs are in use. So that's kind of the resource reconciliation, so you can create new services, which is not necessarily service reconciliation. I was wondering if you're going to get into that.
Yeah, so I was going to talk about that as an advanced topic, but that's part of Mikhail's project. But I would say that, what's important, of course, service systems have a life cycle, correct? And once you got that service into NSO, into the CDB as a service, the life cycle is going to continue. People are going to want to change the bandwidth. And so you need to use NSO right away, because if not, next week the service already changed, you need to reconcile again. So that's very important, correct? So as fast as you get service in, you start, of course, it's at the moment you are ready to shift into using NSO, let's say, in all those services. So the reason why you reconcile a little bit later has to do with, maybe it has to do sometimes, okay, I want to get enough experience into the tool. I want to get enough operational experience. So operations is absolutely on board in terms of the new services. So now I'm ready to put in all the old services also in the platform, correct? And from now on, every service that is moving to the platform, I can move on and do it. Of course, as you mentioned, there's a resource issue. That, of course, depends where do you do resource allocation, correct? And I agree, you need to think about that since for Greenfield, correct, in day one, correct? If NSO is not managing the resources, who is doing it? Okay, any other questions? Yes?
So there is a misconception that, if you do sync from, the services will get reconciled. Most of the customers have that misconception. So we need to educate the customers that when you do sync from, the only device model gets synchronized with the device, that nothing happens on the service model. And when we do sync from, so the problem that he mentioned about VLAN and other thing, those can be already, that's out of box, right? If you want to use those.
Well, it's out of the box, kind of, because then your service logic needs to check that. Correct?
Yeah.
It needs to check that VLAN is not using that interface, this sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a separate thing. Then you're talking about the resource management.
Yeah. So I agree with you, and actually, I don't know if we were here at the beginning, but there's no magic automatics, and we explain why, and I can go back with that. Yep. Okay, let's break and go back at 3 o'clock, and we actually got into more practical lessons, okay?